back, Americans. Hugh Hewitt. Well, Mother's Day has come and gone, but Father's Day is ahead of us. And I doubt very many of you are already thinking about, what am I going to get Dad or Grandpa for Father's Day? Well, I've got it right here. It's called The Road to Surrender, 3 Men in the Countdown to the End of World War III. It's by my radio friend, Evan Thomas. He never writes a bad book. He never turns out anything bad. Everything Evan Thomas writes is great, and that is no different. Is Evan with us yet? The video dropped. Okay. That's what happens when you have authors who have bad bandwidth, is you get them up on video and then they drop and then they miss it. But The Road to Surrender is a fabulous book. The Road to Surrender is exactly what you want to get Dad. It is, and I've tweeted out the link this morning, and you can go. Publication date is June 6th. Pre-order it. You'll get it on June 7th. You'll be able to give it to Dad or Grandpa for Father's Day. You'll be able to give it to anyone who loves history. Evan just can't write a bad book. Evan, welcome. I've been praising Road to Surrender to high heaven, but thank you for joining me this morning. Sorry the link didn't work.
Thank you, Hugh. It's great to talk to you.
Let me begin by saying, like you, my father was in the invasion force for Japan. He ended up being in the occupation army for a year, but he was not a lieutenant like your dad. He was he'd been in the army for 2.5 years. He was a youngster. He was at Zamboanga staging when the atom bombs dropped. Boy, am I glad they dropped, because you detail it here. We would not be talking to each other, would we?
No. Well, I'm not absolutely sure of that. There certainly was a legend in my family, because my dad was the lieutenant on an LST, and they had projected that the Japanese were going to sink 200 LSTs in the first afternoon. They had 7,000 kamikaze planes waiting for them, 1 million troops. But, the Japanese opposition was so great that the Navy, by August, just wanted to blockade Japan and starve them to death. The atom bomb may have saved your dad, my dad, and a lot of dads, maybe, but it definitely saved, and this is so perverse and bizarre, it saved millions of Japanese. I know that doesn't make any sense, but by killing 200,000 Japanese, we may have saved millions of Japanese. Because if we didn't drop the atom bomb on them, we'd either invade them or we'd starve them to death. And they were already experiencing famine. And by, say, Christmas of 1945, there would have been famine, disease, civil war. The Russians would have come in. Just a giant mess. So this is one of these horrible ironies of history. But the atom bombs, in that strange way, saved a lot of lives.
Oh, I want people, if they read nothing else, pick up The Road to Surrender in a bookstore and read pages 84 to 85. I did not know this, Evan, that the Japanese had sussed out the landing beach, Kyushu, and they had tripled the defending. We thought they had 350,000 defenders. They were up to over 900,000. As you mentioned, they had 7,000 kamikaze planes. My mother-in-law's first husband was skipper of the Twigs that went down under a kamikaze outside of Okinawa. They also had, I didn't know this, thousands of suicide bombers in small speedboats, midget submarines, swimmers with 10-kilo TNT charges. This is wild. It would have been the worst battle in history.
Yeah. And, people who wondered, people still come up to me, did we really have to use those bombs? Did we really have to use 2 of them? And my answer to that is this scene. On August 9th, after we have dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, the Supreme War Council of Japan, which are the 6 guys who actually run Japan, they're meeting, and word comes that another Hiroshima-style bomb is dropped on Nagasaki. So now there are 2 atom bombs. And what does the Japanese war minister say? He says, wouldn't it be beautiful if the whole country were to die like a flower? They were in this kind of crazy, suicidal mindset. The newspaper headlines would be, the 100 million, as they called the Japanese population, will die for the emperor. And they meant it.
Evan, what you did, and I think it's relatively new. I remember reading Manchester's biography of MacArthur, American Caesar. I've read a lot of Pacific War history. I never got inside the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War before. I didn't know about Foreign Minister Togo. I did not know about the fanatics running around the Imperial Palace at the end trying to stop the emperor from broadcasting surrender. How did you figure all this out? I gather the literature is deep and we just don't know about it, but this is readable, accessible, and eye-opening.
Thank you. I got into it by a number of ways. One is there are a lot of diaries, which are just a great source because they tell you how people are feeling in real time, and which is always hard to find. But I was very fortunate. I found the grandsons of Togo, the foreign minister named Shigenori Togo, was the only one on that Supreme War Council who wanted to surrender. This made him a vulnerable guy because the crazies wanted to assassinate. In fact, they were not even permitted to use the word surrender in their argument.
Don't go anywhere, Evan. I'm coming back. We're going to play this tomorrow. I'm going to continue my conversation with Evan Thomas about this book, The Road to Surrender. I'll play some more of it tomorrow. All of it will be on today's podcast, but go and pre-order The Road to Surrender if you want it in time for Father's Day to give to your father, your grandfather, your uncle, or anyone who loves military history. A lot of women love military history, too. It is the perfect gift. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Generalissimo. I'll be back for more with Evan Thomas right after this. Welcome back, America. Evan Thomas is my guest. His brand new book, Road to Surrender. I spoke with him initially about it in the last segment of Wednesday's program. I'm replaying this segment in Thursday. They're both on yesterday's podcast. Evan, so we got 12 minutes, and I want to cover a bunch of stuff. I want to cover the Green School, which I had never heard of. I want to cover the Bomber Mafia, which I know about. I've never heard of the Three Sacred Treasures until I read it. I didn't know much about Spats, but mostly I want to talk about Henry Stimson. Because, boy, I didn't know. I thought I knew something about. I knew the FDR jibe you all. Well, you old Republican lawyer, you. That's early in the war. I didn't know anything about him personally. What an admirable man.
He was. He served 6 presidents, and he was somebody who really believed in public service. He became the kind of godfather of what was later known as the East Coast foreign policy establishment, But during World War II, he's the Secretary of War. And can you imagine what that job is like? Fortunately, he got along well with General Marshall. They were both selfless men. They had to make terribly hard decisions. And one of the decisions was whether to drop the atom bomb. And they had to do it, but it's not like they took it lightly. Henry Stimson was 77 years old in 1945. He couldn't sleep. He's a
deeply devout Christian, too. I think that comes through, which I didn't know.
Yeah, deeply devout. He was the real deal. He meant it. And he had this idea after the war. He was hoping we have some kind of Christian awakening because we were dealing with such hard problems. He was worried about a problem that's very relevant today, that science was going to get ahead of morality, that human morality was not going to be able to keep up with science. The science they confronted in 1945 was the atom bomb. Of course, today it's AI and a whole host of other things. But it's the same dilemma. Can human beings handle these incredible machines and science that we're making? Are we up to it? And Stimson believed, he drew on his Christian faith as a source of strength and wisdom. But he knew it was human beings have a dark side. That's the reality. You have to deal with it. And in war, you have to do some dark things.
It was a revelation to me as well that Ike would subsequently say he was opposed to dropping the bomb. Now, the first job I had out of college in 1978 was helping David Eisenhower put together the day-by-day, the TikTok of Ike, because he wrote the book Eisenhower at War. I don't ever remember that Ike was against it. When did he actually announce that, and when did Stimson get mad at him, Evan Thomas?
There's an argument over this because in later years, there's a lot of revisionist history that goes on when people write their memoirs. And Eisenhower and a lot of people said, oh, yeah, well, I was against the bomb. Well, really? Were they in real time? And here's how it would happen. When Eisenhower was told about the bomb, he did say something to Stimson. Do we really have to use this thing? Isn't Japan defeated? And Stimson did get mad at it. I was told this actually by Dwight Eisenhower's son, John Eisenhower, who was an important source for me when I wrote about General Eisenhower. So there was a discussion, but it's not like Eisenhower went to Harry Truman and said don't do it, or even General Marshall. So he had private misgivings. And he made them clear to the Secretary of War, but he didn't really protest. He was out of the loop. It wasn't his chain of command. So people, sometimes exaggerate the morality after the fact.
Well, the morality, I think, you've written the definitive answer to people who object to the dropping of the atomic bomb, which is just the disaster that would have happened. Now I want to talk a little bit about the target list, because this was also a revelation to me. But I had urban myth. Urban myth has dominated my life for 60 years, which is I thought Eleanor Roosevelt said no Kyoto. I thought it was an Eleanor Roosevelt decision that said no Kyoto. Would you explain why no Kyoto?
Well, it might have been, she's the kind of person who would have said no Kyoto, but what happened was it was Henry Stimson who said no Kyoto, because they're putting together a target list, and Kyoto was a great target. A lot of people live there. There's actually some war industry there. But Stimson, who had been to Kyoto as a diplomat back in the 1920s, knew it was this beautiful cultural center of ancient Japanese culture. It had been the capital of Japan back in earlier times. And Stimson just thought it was not, we shouldn't wipe out their cultural center. And so he took it off the target list 3 times. General Groves, who ran the Manhattan Project making the bomb, he thought Kyoto was a great target. He kept putting it back on the list. And finally, Stimson went to President Truman, and they agreed together, no Kyoto. Now, it meant that we bombed Hiroshima instead, so tough on Hiroshima. But it shows you people have to make these terrible moral choices. They tried to save one city. It ended up dooming another city. In war, these are the choices that get made.
The second bomb was far more powerful than the first bomb, but it only killed half as many people because they hit Nagasaki with it. They picked Nagasaki by almost as like it was the fallback, right? They couldn't hit their primary target. I didn't know any of that, Evan.
Yeah. The primary target was a city named Kokura, which was more of a military target that had a big arsenal. But this is, again, ironies. When the bombers arrived, when the B-29 arrived, Kokura was covered by smoke from an earlier firebombing raid by General LeMay's planes, so it was obscured by smoke, and they were under orders to only bomb visually. They had to see their target. So they had to head out and pick the secondary target, which was Nagasaki. It was also clouded over, and they dropped the bomb 1 mile off target, and that's why it killed half as many people as Hiroshima. It was dropped up a valley, which limited the force of the explosion. By wonderful irony, it landed right on top of the Mitsubishi plant that had torpedoes used at Pearl Harbor. How about that for divine retribution?
Again, something I didn't know. Now, I knew about the bomber mafia, but I didn't know that Spats was essential to this. I kind of associate Spats with Europe. I mean, do you find a lot of people who know the war generally, smart people, are surprised by the road to surrender?
Yes, because, they don't. To write a really fun story, you got to get into the weeds, and you can find stuff that people just miss or they don't know about. I mean, General Spaatz was you're right, he was our strategic bombing commander in Europe. He had to kill a lot of people in Europe, including Americans. Did you know that more American airmen died bombing Europe than all the Marines who died in the South Pacific?
I do, because my uncle was a navigator in a flying fortress, and he did 39 missions, and then they rebelled and wouldn't fly the 40th because their captain took off.
Oh, my God, you do know. So those are not quite suicide missions, but the chance of you finishing all 25 missions when that was the limit was, I think, in the 1943, it was like you had a 3 in 4 chance, something like that. I mean, it was just because the Luftwaffe was shooting at us, and it was just an unbelievably dangerous. So Spaatz had to send all these missions out, and then he's tasked to go and finish off Japan, Operation Downfall, and he's told about the atom bomb. And he says, look, if I'm going to kill 100,000 people, I want to see this order in writing. It had been a verbal order, and he insisted on an order in writing to drop this bomb.
And then he lost it.
He lost it. He kept the order in his back pocket, and they took his pants to the cleaners. He lost the order.
There's a lot in here. I want to cover 2 more things in our time, Evan. The Green School, I have never heard of. I'm going to be very interested in what Japanese readers, is this going to be translated into Japanese and available in Japan?
I think it's available in Japan. I don't know if it'll be translated, but some way it'll be available in Japan.
So tell people about the Green School.
These purists who believe that it's one of these complicated metaphors about how a green tree is ever greener against the snow. It's about purity. And the Japanese believed in purity, and they thought they were going to die for the emperor. But in the way the people work, if the emperor wasn't pure enough, they'd replace him and get a better emperor. That's the way autocracies justify, what they're doing. And the true believers were thinking about removing the current emperor, Hirohito, and replacing him with a better emperor who would be more suicidal. And Hirohito was sort of a meek guy in many ways. In the end, he stands up, and he does surrender. This is a kind of a brave thing to do, but he knows his country is doomed, and he also knows that maybe the B-29s are coming for him. He's not wrong about this. President Truman told the British that he was getting ready to use a third atom bomb on Tokyo. He said that to the British ambassador 4 hours before he learned that Japan had surrendered. So we damn near dropped an atom bomb on Tokyo.
I want to conclude here. We didn't really quite know what they were. George Marshall was thinking about, this was a revelation to me again in The Road to Surrender. He was thinking about using them as battlefield weapons, not considering what would happen to the American troops who had to travel through the crater.
Yeah, he was thinking of using 9 of them as tactical weapons. How about that? Because as we were talking earlier, the opposition, they were dug in caves, and how he thought about drenching them in poison gas or using 9 tactical weapons. They didn't know much about radiation, and the scientists didn't really tell them about radiation, so this was nuts. But, yes, General Marshall was talking to his assistants about dropping 9 tactical atom bombs on Japanese defenses and then waiting a day and marching across the battlefield. Well, that would have been, just
they would have all died of radiation poisoning. Very last question, Evan, and thanks for your time today. In Road to Surrender, Harry Truman comes across as exactly what we needed at the time. I'm not sure, it's counterfactual, what FDR would have done, whether he would have started. FDR thought he had a pretty good deal going with Stalin. He was hoodwinked by Stalin, by Alger Hiss. Do you think it would have been different if FDR had lived?
No. I think FDR would have used the bomb, too. I mean, FDR was hard to pin down. That's one thing that made him great. You didn't exactly know what he was going to do. He could negotiate with the Russians. But I think FDR, too, would have used, because really there was no choice. We had to use those weapons.
Or thousands and tens, and maybe 1 million Americans would have died in this. Wow. By the way, I don't know if your dad was in the occupation. The Japanese were a much easier occupation than I think any other occupation we've ever dealt with. And I think a lot has to do with the emperor. Do you agree with that?
Yes. I mean, the Japanese are hierarchical, and the emperor wisely said, you have to lay down your arms. And he sent his princes all over to the Japanese army. Of course, they occupied Asia, saying, lay down your arms and cooperate. And they did. There were a few last kamikazes, there were, but mostly the Japanese bowed to higher authority. MacArthur was brilliant about using the emperor as higher authority. And so the Japanese, having been suicidal fanatics, changed and went along with the occupation reasonably gracefully. And America performed a magnificent role in helping rebuild Japan into the great country that it is today.
And our strong ally in another Cold War. Road to Surrender, 3 Men and the Countdown to the End of World War II. Available for ordering now. It'll arrive on June 6th or 7th. You'll be able to give it to dad, grandpa, uncles, or your husband if they like military history on Father's Day. And a lot of women like military history, too. And this is really riveting. Evan, congratulations. You never write a bad book. It's really astonishing to me. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, I really appreciate it.
Be well.